All right, well, welcome to week 2. This is going to be lecture 3. And again, I want to remind us that we're navigating some complex terrain here, maybe being introduced to some concepts for the first time. I'm giving you a shallow overview because this is not a philosophy class. I'm just trying to help us understand some of the constructs that inform how you and I recognize and understand what ministry and why ministry feels different at different times throughout history. And so I want to make sure that we're paying attention to those realities. So we talked about how in pre-modernity there's this sense that the world is enchanted, that God is at the sort of the peak of the hierarchy of all of the cosmos, and that really making sense of our place in the world is about discerning the will of God for the world, and then reflecting on earth the sort of heavenly structures, the heavenly power that God has. Well, what this led to at the end of pre-modernity and then moving into modernity, or through the Enlightenment, was a series of vicious wars between those who laid claim to the belief that they were the ones adequately representing God's will for the world. They're the ones who had laid claim to the authority of God for the sake of the world. And so that was within the context of Catholics and Protestants. It leads to this incredibly bloody war, fought in the name of religion at times, but very much tied and politically embedded, because again, in an enchanted world, those two are hard to separate out. And I want to say this, and this is probably an aside. Many countries and places and tribes across this globe still operate within that pre-modern mindset. The Enlightenment has not happened for them. And we'll talk about what the Enlightenment is. And so when we say that, they convolute politics and religion, and they need to separate those two out, that's a Western invention. Because in a pre-modern mindset, those two are deeply embedded. Because the whole of existence is under the authority, the rulership of God. And so for us to somehow assume that you can compartmentalize is already assuming a cosmological construct that many places around the globe don't share. And so I think that's really important for us to understand what makes our interactions with other cultures so complex. And I really think it helps us to understand the challenges we face when we do missions globally, and we forget that we may have the assumptions of cosmological constructs that others don't share. So when we move away from the 30 Years' War, this bloody warfare that happened in Europe, it sets the stage for what we call the Enlightenment or modernity, which is this belief that we can discern truth, rightness, that we can discern the best way of living in this world, disconnected from the doctrines of religious belief or the assumptions of enchantment. That making sense of the world around us is not based upon understanding God's will for the world and ordering ourselves in light of God's ordering, but instead through reason and experience, understanding the laws of nature, how this world has been rooted and operated, and aligning ourselves in constructive ways with the laws of nature. And so we have people that emerged during this time that maybe you've heard their names: René Descartes, John Locke, Adam Smith, Sir Isaac Newton. These are philosophers that cover a range from epistemology, which is how do we know what we know, to political science, how do we structure and organize who we are as a polis in this world that is now disconnected or disenchanted or demythologized from or derooted from this idea of who God is and God's will, to economics and this idea of market and capitalism. These voices all emerge based upon a new cosmological construct which is no longer dependent upon the divine will of God, but instead the laws of nature. And so there's this belief, there's this sort of rational hubris, this arrogance that begins to pop up, where reason alone can help us to discern what is right and good in this world and how we ought to operate in this world. And the world, the cosmos, becomes mechanistic. Like, all we have to be able to do is to break it down in its pieces so that we can discern how it operates, so that we can predict the outcomes, so that we can control what it is that we do and produce. It values standardization and homogeneity. It wants to decontextualize all knowledge because we're operating in the realm of universal truths based upon reason and laws of nature that don't change regardless of where you are. Okay? And so we begin to value these things based upon the assumptions of how we believe the cosmos to work. And if it was once, now I want you to think about this, if it was once that divine hierarchy, divine authority, gave authority to those powers on earth that reflected that divine authority to exercise power to accomplish its goals, it's now the authority of universal reason that gives us the reason to assert power over those who are unreasonable. So you see this authoritarianism begin to develop within modernity, that's rooted on this idea that once we have figured out how the world works, the laws of nature, that the ways in which truth and reality are, we can impose those on the uncivilized or the unthoughtful or the unreflective or the primitive, right? And it gives, because we are the ones that have figured out the world, and it's our mission then to provide that substance to everyone else. This is colonialization at its best, right? That we colonize because we believe that we're civilizing the barbarians, right? The peoples of this earth who are so primitive, and they're still stuck in their superstitions and their gods and their enchantment, but we don't need that. So that even influences how we did missions, right? It's this colonizing imperialism of mission. Well, what that does for the mission of God is that within modernity, we don't really need the Spirit of God. All we need to be able to do is to understand how the world works, understand how to break things down to the reduced parts, understanding causality. If you do this, this is the outcome. And if we can do that well enough, and we can treat the world mechanistically, then we can predict outcomes and we can control outcomes. And so the belief was, as we moved into the 20th century, I mean, the church growth movement is a prime example of this. If you practice these practices, if you understand these procedures, if you do things like this that are in alignment with the laws of nature, that they're rational, they're reasonable, they're tried, and they're true, you will get these sort of outcomes. So it operated in terms of reduction, compartmentalization, and predictability. That's Newtonian physics at its best, right? So if pre-modernity was shaped by this idea of enchantment, modernity was rooted in disenchantment. But also the belief that the human capacity to rationally understand and control nature and outcomes, standardization, homogeneity, predictability, that we can work ourselves into our desired future. But what we come to realize in the 20th century is maybe that's not how things work. In fact, if you look at the quote, there's a couple quotes here that I want us to look at before we move into the next lecture. And it says this: in much of the American church, we don't think we need the Holy Spirit. If we have our demographic and psychographic study of our community, develop a strategic plan, create great marketing, and write a sharp mission statement, we're ready to go. But if we trust in the Spirit of God, we no longer rely on our slick marketing or our seminary degrees or the tips we've we've come to learn from the latest conferences. This is from Bob Roberts, who's a brilliant theologian and pastor in Dallas. And he's saying that what modernity did is it stripped us from the need of the Spirit of God at work in our churches, because we didn't need it. We can control outcomes. You can grow a church without the Spirit of God. But then what we move in the 20th century is towards a new cosmological construct, to what we call postmodernity, or from the enchantment of the premodernity to the mechanistic worldview of modernity, to a more chaos and complexity version of reality in postmodernity. And from your article it says this: if nature turns out to be much less deterministic than we hitherto thought, if equilibrium is far from being the norm in nature, and if new patterns emerge from the iterative interactions of a number of agents on a computer, then perhaps our hitherto mechanistic approach to understanding the messiness we normally associate with the social world may need revisiting. There's a new social construct that emerges of chaos and complexity that reshapes how we understand our participation in the world, and we've got to navigate that in these next few lectures.